I invite you, for a moment, to picture a quiet reading room in the Georgia Historical Society. The faint smell of leather bindings, the whisper of brittle paper turning, the dust motes caught in shafts of pale light. On the table before you lies a plantation ledger from 1841, its calfskin cover worn to softness by a century of handling. Inside, neat rows of ink record the rhythm of an antebellum household, shipments of rice, repairs to a carriage axle, a debt repaid in barrels of molasses. And then, with no special emphasis, a single line that seems as ordinary as all the rest. Item: Servant Isaac, transfer to Charleston, health reasons. It is an entry that would slide past most eyes without pause. Yet this quiet, bureaucratic breath, this bland and bloodless notation, conceals something far more intimate and far more dangerous than a simple change in inventory. That one line, as unremarkable as a period on a page, was the thin veneer of respectability laid over one of the most forbidden love stories in the history of the Deep South. And before we peel back that veneer together, let us know in the comments what city you're watching from and what time you hit play. Where and when we return to the past changes how its ghosts speak. And tonight, those ghosts are ready to whisper. Rosehaven Plantation stood just beyond the salt marshes of Chatham County, a Greek revival house with fluted white columns, broad verandas, and an air of wealth that clung to it like humidity. To passers-by, it was the image of Southern order, a place where the genteel rituals of tea and prayer concealed the brutality on which they rested. The Whitcomb family had owned it for 3 generations. Their wealth came from indigo first, then rice, and finally the cotton that poured through the gins and down the river to Savannah's waiting ships. And in 1841, the mistress of this house, Evelyn Whitcomb, was 23 and the very model of Southern womanhood, refined, educated, pious, and soon to be engaged, or so the society pages confidently predicted. Her name, however, does not appear in the ledger beside Isaac's. It was not the custom to record the private inclinations of daughters. The servant in question, Isaac Mercer, had been purchased from an Augusta estate 5 years earlier, a teenager with an aptitude for horses and a talent for song. He was tasked with managing the Whitcomb stables, a role that required trust and proximity, and one that placed him in frequent orbit around the young heiress. Contemporary oral accounts speak of a man with a voice that could quiet thunder and hands that could gentle even a broken mare. The ledger calls him property. The memories that survived call him indispensable. For decades, that single ledger entry was the only surviving trace of his life at Rosehaven. It explained nothing, not why the transfer was necessary, nor why, weeks later, Isaac reappeared in Savannah without any record of a sale. The silence was total. And then, in 1912, while dismantling the attic floorboards during a renovation, workers uncovered a sealed envelope pressed flat between the joists. Inside were several damp, stuck-together pages, scraps of letters that scholars would spend months coaxing apart. One fragment, in a delicate looping hand, reads simply, E. Kept awake by Isaac's singing. No surname, no date, but the watermark on the paper matched the Whitcomb family's stationery from the late 1830s. That fragment transformed the ledger from a document of property into a map of erasure. What had been interpreted as a routine transfer now pulsed with suspicion. Why had Evelyn written of a servant's song? Why hide such a note in the attic's dark ribs? And why, if Isaac had truly been sent away for health reasons, was he back within weeks, his name gone from the books? Historians began to suspect that the ledger's language was not merely euphemistic, but deliberately false. In the mid-19th century South, health reasons was a phrase often used to obscure scandal, a pregnancy, an illness of disrepute, or an event that threatened the family's name. The stakes of that concealment cannot be overstated. In 1841, Georgia, intimacy across the color line was not simply taboo, it was a legal and mortal danger. Enslaved men accused of relations with white women could be hanged without trial, their bodies mutilated as warning. Women of Evelyn's class faced ruin, confinement, even institutionalization for moral insanity. To love in such a context was to stake one's life against a world that would kill to preserve its order. And so love, if it existed, learned to hide. It spoke not in the language of courtship letters, but in rosemary sprigs pressed into books. It carved initials into the margins of otherwise pious notes. It buried itself between the boards of an attic ceiling, where no one was supposed to look. In 1965, more than a century after the original entry was written, a graduate student at Emory University re-examined the ledger with infrared light. What they discovered made the document's banality collapse. The word transfer had been written over another, scraped nearly clean by a razor blade. Under magnification, the original word emerged: burial. Whether this referred to a person or a secret laid to rest, no one could say. But the revision spoke volumes. Somewhere in the Whitcomb household, someone had rewritten history, had decided that what once needed to be buried should instead appear as something routine and forgettable. From that moment, the ledger ceased to be a trustworthy witness. It became instead a participant in the cover-up, a collaborator in silence. And the question shifted from what happened to what was so devastating that it had to be erased. The small surviving hints, the scribbled I am and scratched out heart in Evelyn's letters, the testimony of an elderly nurse recalling a haunting lullaby, the memory of a carriage seen leaving Rosehaven in the dead of night, all began to point toward the same conclusion. Something dangerous and tender had unfolded in the shadowed spaces of that estate. What the ink refused to name, the artifacts began to whisper. And as we follow those whispers deeper into the archives, past the ledger, past the attic, past even the shallow grave unearthed near the rose garden, we are forced to confront a possibility that polite history has labored mightily to forget, that Evelyn Whitcomb and Isaac Mercer loved one another, and that the world around them conspired not only to destroy that love, but to erase it altogether. The ledger lied, and as we begin this investigation, we must learn to read between its lines, because what it does not say may be the most important story it has to tell. If the ledger line is our first crack in the veneer of Rosehaven, then Evelyn Whitcomb herself is the surface the crack runs across. History remembers her, if it remembers her at all, as a figure of grace and wealth, a woman who inherited not only her family's land, but its reputation for respectability. Born in 1818, Evelyn was the only surviving child of Thomas and Margaret Whitcomb, and by the time she turned 23, she had become the quiet center of Chatham County's social orbit. She spoke French with a Parisian accent polished by imported tutors, collected botanical specimens from her family's greenhouse, and read the moral essays of Hannah More aloud to the parish orphans on Sundays. She was precisely what a Whitcomb daughter was meant to be: refined, obedient, and unmarred by scandal. But as every historian knows, the biographies written by society pages are often little more than fairy tales wrapped in etiquette. Behind that carefully arranged portrait, the first signs of dissonance were already visible. Evelyn's private notebooks, preserved in a cedar chest and discovered during a 1937 estate sale, reveal not the tidy mind of a socialite, but the restless curiosity of someone ill at ease with the boundaries drawn around her. She copied out abolitionist pamphlets under the heading "Forbidden Thoughts," then scratched them out. She annotated sermons with sharp questions about divine justice and the ownership of souls. And on the inside cover of a botanical catalogue she wrote, in a hand so small it seems almost like a whisper, "Nothing that grows can truly be owned." That line alone is enough to transform Evelyn from the cardboard silhouette of a plantation belle into something far more dangerous. A young woman who had begun to see the moral rot beneath the marble floors of her own inheritance. There is a temptation, when looking back at Evelyn's life, to assume inevitability, to see her entanglement with Isaac as the obvious consequence of her temperament. But such conclusions ignore the risk. She lived within a lattice of laws and customs designed to police her every breath. Her marriage, like her property, would be a transaction meant to fortify family alliances and expand cotton empires. Her conduct reflected not only on herself, but on the lineage that bore her name. Any deviation from that script could shatter the delicate illusion on which families like the Whitcombs depended. And yet, as the fragments of evidence suggest, Evelyn was already deviating, slipping out into the stables under pretext, lingering too long by the laurel walk, humming back the melodies Isaac sang while currying the horses. A letter from her cousin Nathaniel, dated October 1840, hints at the family's growing unease. Evelyn's attention to the lower quarters is remarked upon, he wrote, and not kindly. I trust she remembers the dignity of her station. That single sentence, not kindly, betrays the gossip that must have been swirling through the drawing rooms of Savannah. It also foreshadows the family's later decision to rewrite the record entirely. For if Evelyn's attentions had remained mere eccentricity, they would not have required erasure. It was the possibility of intimacy, something deeper and more dangerous, that demanded obliteration. By early 1841, the tension between Evelyn's public life and private impulses had begun to strain even the household's architecture. Visitors to Rosehaven recorded glimpses of her pacing the verandas long after midnight, a lantern bobbing in her hand. One recalled hearing soft singing from the direction of the stables, and glimpsing a shadow crossing the lawn. Her mother, Margaret, began accompanying her more frequently on afternoon walks, a chaperone's vigilance disguised as maternal concern. And yet, despite these watchful eyes, Evelyn continued to carve out small pockets of autonomy. She requested new volumes from Charleston's circulating library, many of them radical for their time. Accounts of Haitian revolutionaries, pamphlets on the British abolitionist movement, and most tellingly, a translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses, with notes on forbidden unions scribbled in the margins. Even her wardrobe began to change. The inventory records show purchases of simpler muslin gowns and sturdy boots, practical for walking beyond the ornamental gardens into the working quarters, a detail that must have horrified her mother, who favored elaborate crinolines and imported lace. Evelyn, it seems, was preparing for encounters the parlors were never meant to host. And if the oral testimonies collected a century later can be trusted, those encounters did occur. Formerly enslaved descendants from the Rosehaven grounds spoke of a lady in white who would pause by the well at dusk to listen to the men sing, and of a man named Isaac who sang not to the fields, but to her. Still, Evelyn was not reckless. The Whitcombs' wealth and influence insulated her from suspicion, and she wielded that insulation as a shield. Invitations to teas and parish committees multiplied, a flurry of visible propriety that cloaked the quiet rebellion unfolding in the shadows. It was a dangerous balancing act, one that required her to maintain the illusion of docility, even as she dismantled it piece by piece. And it is here that her story becomes more than a simple romance. It becomes an act of resistance, not the loud, fiery resistance of speeches and revolts, but the subtle, devastating kind that blooms in the margins of ledgers and the folds of letters. The deeper we look into Evelyn's life, the clearer this duality becomes. Every act of conformity seems shadowed by a trace of defiance. Her attendance at church services was impeccable, but tucked into her prayer book was a pressed violet, a flower Isaac was known to cultivate near the stables. She accepted a suitor's proposal of courtship, but never responded to his letters, She played Chopin at a society recital, then slipped away to walk the perimeter fence in the dark. These contradictions taken together speak to a woman waging an internal war between duty and desire, reputation and conscience. And it was only a matter of time before that war erupted into something history could neither ignore nor fully record. In Evelyn Whitcomb, we find not a passive figure swept up by circumstance, but an active participant in the shaping of her fate. She understood the cost of what she was doing, the risk to her name, her safety, even her life. And still she moved toward the one person the law told her she could not love. If the ledger tried to erase her story, these scattered traces, the annotations, the violets, the whispered songs, restore it, line by line. And as we follow those traces forward, we leave the manicured verandas of Rosehaven behind and step into the stables themselves, where the man the ledger called Servant Isaac was waiting, and where history itself would soon be rewritten beneath the cover of night. If Evelyn Whitcomb was the surface on which Rosehaven's cracks began to show, then Isaac Mercer was the pressure building beneath, unseen by polite society, unacknowledged by law, yet powerful enough to reshape the lives orbiting around him. The plantation ledger calls him servant. The oral traditions of those who came after call him Isaac of the stables, and in those few surviving syllables is a life far larger than the records ever intended to preserve. He was born around 1818, near Augusta, to an enslaved woman known only as Dinah and an unknown father, and by 16 he had been sold to the Whitcomb estate in exchange for 3 mules and a wagon wheel. His early years at Rosehaven were marked not by rebellion, but by quiet competence. He learned the moods of horses as if they were a second language, repaired harnesses with a craftsman's care, and sang hymns in a soft, untrained tenor that seemed to soothe both beast and human. The steward's notes, written with the detached tone of a man recording livestock, remark that the boy Mercer is of unusual skill, worth his keep. It is the kind of faint praise that, in its coldness, reveals more about the recorder than the recorded. And yet, scattered across archives and oral accounts, fragments emerge that complicate this picture. A letter from Nathaniel Whitcomb mentions the young man with the scar on his knuckle, who knows more of the land than half the overseers, a former enslaved woman interviewed by the Works Progress Administration in the 1930s, remembered a stable boy who sang old songs from the other side of the water. These shards of memory suggest that Isaac carried with him not just skill, but lineage, fragments of African rhythm and agricultural knowledge that no ledger could itemize. Even the scar, described so casually, hints at a deeper story. Some said it came from a fight in the auction yard, others that it was punishment for refusing an order. Whatever its origin, it marked him physically as someone who had endured and survived. Isaac's proximity to Evelyn was not immediate, but it was inevitable. The stable was not far from the main house, and horses were essential to the rhythms of plantation life. Evelyn's morning rides, part exercise, part performance, required Isaac's preparation. He adjusted her saddle, steadied her mount, and over time began to teach her how to control the more spirited animals himself. One surviving account from a neighbor recalls seeing Miss Whitcomb astride a bay mare, laughing as the stable boy ran beside her, giving instruction as though he were the master. That small detail, laughter shared across the social gulf, would have been scandalous enough, but something more dangerous was forming beneath the surface. In the late summer of 1840, Evelyn suffered a fall from her horse. The household physician noted only a sprain of the wrist and a mild shock, but a note in the steward's log records that Isaac was summoned to the house repeatedly during her convalescence. Whether this was for practical reasons or something more intimate is impossible to say. What is certain is that, from that season onward, their names appear together more frequently in the surviving traces of Rosehaven's life. Evelyn's notebooks contain references to stable schedules and veterinary remedies, matters that would never have crossed a planter's daughter's desk unless discussed in long conversation. Isaac's work logs become less detailed, as if the steward himself had grown wary of recording too much. It is here that we encounter the first whispers of their forbidden bond. Oral history collected from descendants of Rosehaven's enslaved community speaks of the lady who came to the stables when the moon was high, and the singing that changed its tune. These are not the sorts of details that appear in court records or family genealogies, but they have the texture of lived memory, the kind of stories passed down because they explain the otherwise inexplicable. And in 1968, a small scrap of parchment was found wedged into a gap in the stable's wall during restoration. It bore only a few words, written in a feminine hand. "The stars are brighter when you sing." It is impossible to prove Evelyn wrote it. Yet when held beside the other fragments, the attic note about Isaac's singing, the shift in her reading habits, the scarred knuckle, the mosaic begins to resolve into something undeniable. The risks they faced cannot be overstated. For Isaac, discovery meant death without recourse. For Evelyn, it meant ruin, perhaps confinement in one of the moral asylums that dotted the South by the 1850s. And so, their intimacy, if intimacy indeed bloomed, adapted itself to the landscape of terror in which it existed. It hid in plain sight, disguised as necessity. Evelyn had reason to visit the stables, after all, and Isaac was expected to attend to her mounts. Their conversations could be dismissed as instruction, their shared silences as happenstance. Even their songs, his in the yard, hers at the pianoforte, could be interpreted as coincidence by those unwilling to see more. But the human heart, as history so often reminds us, is ill-suited to remain a secret. The bond between them left traces even where erasure was most thorough. A set of harnesses in the Rosehaven carriage house bears initials scratched faintly into the leather: I.W., Isaac, and perhaps Whitcomb. A broken brooch found near the stable well bears Evelyn's monogram, and a letter from Margaret Whitcomb to her sister in Savannah laments, without explanation, that the girl has grown distant, and her eyes linger where they should not. Each piece, on its own, is circumstantial. Together, they form a constellation that points unerringly toward the same forbidden star. Isaac's life after the ledger entry remains largely obscured, but one tantalizing clue appears in a Freedmen's Bureau report from 1867. Among the names listed as petitioners for land in Chatham County is an Isaac M., occupation, horse trainer. The handwriting is shaky, the record incomplete, but the age listed, 49, would place him squarely in the same generation. Whether this was the same Isaac who once sang to Evelyn under the Georgia moon, we cannot say with certainty, but it suggests that, against all odds, he may have survived the storm that followed their secret. Isaac Mercer was never meant to be remembered. The system into which he was born was designed to erase men like him, to strip them of lineage and legacy until they existed only as marks in an account book. Yet piece by piece, his presence forces itself back into the historical record, not as property, but as a person, a teacher, a singer, and perhaps a lover. And as his shadow sharpens, the story of Rosehaven shifts again. No longer is it only the tale of a restless heiress peering over the walls of her privilege. It is also the story of a man whose humanity persisted, even when the world conspired to deny it, and whose voice, soft, unrecorded yet enduring, would one day echo through the ruins of the plantation that tried to forget him. By the spring of 1841, Rosehaven's manicured facade had begun to fracture under the weight of a secret it was never designed to contain. The whispers started small. A servant's murmured speculation, a neighbor's raised eyebrow, but they moved swiftly, carried on the humid Georgia air that slipped through shuttered parlors and over garden walls. They spoke of strange things, of the mistress's lantern burning past midnight, of a familiar tenor voice drifting through the laurel walk after the household had gone to bed, of boot prints and slipper marks pressed side by side into the damp soil near the garden gate. None of it was proof, but none of it aligned with the world Rosehaven pretended to be. The garden itself became the stage on which the forbidden unfolded. Planned decades earlier in the English style, it was a maze of hedgerows and shaded alcoves, dotted with benches and stone urns. During the day, it was Evelyn's domain of polite domesticity, a place where she arranged tea for visiting ladies and pruned roses in muslin gloves. But at night, it transformed into something altogether different. The laurel walk shielded it from the overseer's eyes. The jasmine climbing the trellises filled the air with a sweet, heavy perfume that masked more human scents. And the old oak at the far end, its branches bent like an archway, created a hidden alcove beyond the reach of the house's lanterns. It was there, the oral testimonies insist, that Evelyn and Isaac met. A letter fragment discovered in 1939, folded into the hollow of a wooden bench, offers a tantalizing hint. The ink had bled beyond recognition in places, but enough remained to read. The moon is full, the path is soft. Come as you can. E. The handwriting matched the attic note about Isaac's singing. Scholars debated whether the message was ever sent, or if it was discarded in fear. But its existence alone suggests the depth of the risk she was willing to take. And with risk came invention. Isaac began to time his stable duties to coincide with Evelyn's garden walks. He sang low songs, not the hymns expected of him, but melodies whose cadences bent and shifted like conversations carried on the wind. She, in turn, began to linger after dusk, ostensibly tending to the roses, her lantern swinging in slow arcs that could be seen from the stable yard. These meetings were not confessions shouted into the night. They were whispers, built from gestures too subtle to be documented. A sprig of rosemary left on a bench, a single glove tucked into the stable's hayloft, a broken brooch buried shallow in the soil. These artifacts, each recovered long after Rosehaven's fall, form a vocabulary of resistance. In a society where words could condemn them, Evelyn and Isaac built a language of objects, of presence and absence, of what was left behind for the other to find. Even the garden itself bears evidence of their shared touch. A patch of night blooming, jasmine, a species not listed in the Whitcomb horticultural records, appeared suddenly near the oak archway around that time, perhaps planted by Isaac, perhaps requested by Evelyn. It bloomed only after dark, its fragrance strongest in the hours when they could meet. But secrets of this nature are fragile things, and Rosehaven's walls were alive with watching eyes. Overseers noticed Isaac's absences from the quarters. Margaret Whitcomb complained of her daughter's nervous constitution and wandering habits in a letter to a Savannah friend. Nathaniel's tone in his correspondence grew more pointed, warning that idle tongues may ruin more than one reputation. The household began to tighten its routines. Evelyn was assigned additional chaperones for her walks. Isaac's duties were shifted away from the stables and toward the lower fields. Yet the whispers did not stop. They only burrowed deeper, and in their stubborn persistence, they became something more than gossip. They became threat. One night in June of 1841, a groundskeeper reported seeing a figure near the oak alcove well past midnight. He claimed it was too tall to be the mistress, too graceful to be a man. Days later, Isaac's name vanished from the work logs, replaced by the vague phrase, transferred to Charleston. The ledger, always so precise, fell suddenly silent, but the silence was louder than any entry. Why note his departure at all if he were merely being reassigned? And why, if he had been sold or sent away, did a horse's grooming schedule still bear the initials I.M. 3 weeks later? It was as if the plantation itself were trying to rewrite the past in real time, and failing. The oral accounts collected nearly a century later fill in what the written record refuses to admit. One woman, a descendant of Rosehaven's enslaved population, spoke of a man who ran because love would get him killed, and of a lady who cried under the oak when the night bloomers opened. Another told of a baby born, too light for the quarters and too dark for the house, whose existence was known only in hushed tones before the overseer came, and the ground was disturbed by the roses. These testimonies, unverifiable and heavy with the distortions of memory, nonetheless align with the artifacts. The burial record later scraped from the ledger, the child-sized shoe unearthed near the garden fence, the physician's note about Evelyn's nervous faint upon her return from Charleston. There is a moral gravity to these whispers that transcends their uncertainty. They force us to confront the violence beneath the veneer of Southern gentility, a violence not just of whips and chains, but of memory itself. The Whitcombs did not merely forbid a relationship. They sought to erase it. They pruned their family tree to exclude inconvenient branches. They rewrote their ledgers to disguise scandal as routine. They buried not only bodies but stories, confident that time and silence would finish the work. And yet, even in erasure, traces endure. The jasmine still blooms at night. The initials carved into the harness leather have not worn away. The oak still bends over the garden path like a sentinel. These remnants remind us that history's silences are never absolute. They hum beneath the surface, waiting for someone to listen closely enough to hear them. Evelyn and Isaac's story, if story is the right word for something so fragmented, survived because whispers, unlike proclamations, are hard to kill. They slip between pages, seep through soil, and echo in the spaces the ledgers leave blank. And as those whispers grow louder, they pull us inexorably toward the most tangible proof of all, an artifact so damning that the family hid it beneath the floorboards and prayed no one would ever find it. The daguerreotype. It is there, in that tarnished silver plate, that the world Rosehaven tried to bury will rise again. If whispers are the language of memory, then artifacts are the grammar. And none speaks more clearly, or more damningly, than the image discovered in 1932 beneath the warped floorboards of Rosehaven's West Parlor. Hidden inside a small tin cigar box sealed with wax, wrapped in yellowing scraps of newspaper dated 1845, was a daguerreotype plate, no larger than a hand. Its surface was tarnished and pitted from decades of neglect, the silvered image half obscured by corrosion. Yet when the archivists polished away the soot and years, the photograph revealed something that no ledger, no letter, no polite obituary had ever dared confess. There she was, Evelyn Whitcomb, the heiress of Rosehaven, seated in a carved chair with a posture that betrayed both poise and tension. And beside her, one hand resting loosely on his knee, sat a man whose presence defied everything the society around them believed possible. His skin was dark, his jaw strong and angular, and even though the brim of his hat cast his eyes in shadow, the faint scar along his knuckle was visible. It was the same scar described in the overseer's accounts, the same scar mentioned in oral tradition, the same scar that marked Isaac Mercer. And there, in that captured second of light, the truth of what the Whitcombs had spent decades burying stared back from the silver plate. The daguerreotype's existence was, in itself, a scandal. Portrait photography in the 1840s was expensive and deliberate. To sit for such an image required intention, consent, and, perhaps most importantly, a willingness to risk discovery. That Evelyn and Isaac had chosen to be photographed together, or allowed themselves to be, speaks volumes about the depth of their bond. It was not a fleeting infatuation or whispered flirtation in the garden shadows. It was a relationship they sought, however briefly, to immortalize, even if the world would never be allowed to see it. The family's reaction to the photograph, though undocumented, can be inferred from what followed. The plate was hidden, not displayed. The cigar box was sealed, not catalogued. And beneath the parlor floor where it lay buried for nearly a century, the wood showed signs of having been hastily replaced. Someone, most likely Nathaniel Whitcomb, whose memorandum from 1866 speaks of materials likely to scandalize, had gone to extraordinary lengths to erase the image from the historical record. But the attempt was futile. Objects, unlike people, do not forget. They wait, patient and silent, until someone uncovers them and demands their testimony. The daguerreotype was not the only physical evidence to surface. In 1891, workers repairing a fence near Rosehaven's Rose Garden unearthed a small iron clasp and fragments of cloth no larger than a child's palm. They assumed at first it was debris from an old burial. But when they dug deeper, they found the faint outline of a grave, shallow, unmarked, and long forgotten. No name appears in the parish register for that plot. No funeral is recorded in the family journals. Yet the burial's location, directly beneath the patch of night-blooming jasmine that had appeared inexplicably in 1841, is a fact that history cannot explain away. Oral accounts passed down through generations of Rosehaven's black community lend a chilling dimension to this discovery. They speak of a baby, too light for the quarters and too dark for the house, a child whispered about for only a few weeks before disappearing without trace. One story tells of overseers arriving under the cover of night, of voices raised and quickly silenced, and of Evelyn retreating into her room for weeks afterward, emerging only once, her hair shorn and her expression hollow. Another recalls a small wooden cross appearing near the garden gate, only to be torn down by morning. None of these testimonies can be proved. All of them point in the same direction. The physician's notes from that same year deepen the mystery further. Among his papers, recovered in Charleston in 1978, is a single line written in a steady, impersonal hand. Patient suffered a nervous collapse following sustained grief. The name is not given, but the date matches Evelyn's brief disappearance from parish records. Her mother's correspondence from the same period refers cryptically to a misfortune we must never speak of again. And in the family ledger, the same that recorded Isaac's transfer, the pages for Midsummer 1841 have been torn out entirely. Here, in the silence of the missing pages and the emptiness of the grave, we encounter the brutal efficiency with which Southern society policed its boundaries. It was not enough to punish. It was not enough to conceal. It was necessary to obliterate, to leave no trace of the transgression, no evidence that could challenge the rigid hierarchies on which power rested. And yet, despite every effort to erase Evelyn and Isaac's story, the material world itself resisted. The daguerreotype survived. The clasp remained in the soil. The altered ledger betrayed its own lie. These objects became witnesses in a trial that history had hoped would never occur. The image of Evelyn and Isaac sitting side by side, captured in the silver light of the daguerreotype, remains perhaps the most haunting piece of evidence in the entire saga. It is not simply a portrait. It is a declaration, a rebellion against a world that refused to see their humanity. It tells us that, for at least one moment in 1841, they refused to live entirely in the shadows. They dared to fix their bond into the physical world, even if that world tried to crush them for it. And it is precisely because of that defiance that their story continues to unsettle us, nearly 2 centuries later. The grave beneath the roses, too, speaks, though in a language of absence rather than presence. Whether it held a child, a secret, or merely the weight of what could not be endured, it is a scar upon the landscape that refuses to heal. It reminds us that history is not only written in ink, but carved into the earth itself. And some scars, no matter how deeply buried, rise again when the soil shifts. The daguerreotype and the burial together transform Evelyn and Isaac's story from rumor into reckoning. They are not mere symbols of forbidden love. They are evidence of the lengths to which society will go to suppress it, and the stubbornness with which truth resists suppression. They invite us to question how many other images, how many other graves, lie hidden beneath floorboards and gardens across the South, silent witnesses to lives erased from polite memory. And as we stare into that tarnished silver plate, we must confront an uncomfortable reality. The ledger lied. The family lied. History itself, written by those with power, lied. But the earth and the artifacts and the fragments of human memory refused to comply. They waited, as all truths do, for the day they would be seen again. In the end, history often folds back upon itself, sealing over the wounds it does not wish to confront. After 1841, the Whitcomb family ledger resumes its calm procession of ink and order, as if nothing at all had happened. The entries return to their familiar rhythms: cotton yields, weather reports, a payment to a Charleston merchant, and the brief, trembling line about Isaac's transfer is never mentioned again. Evelyn's name, too, slips into the expected script. In 1843, the ledger records her marriage to a planter from Beaufort County. In 1844, the birth of a daughter named Margaret. The family's public face, briefly distorted by a hidden scandal, smooths itself once more into the serene mask of Southern respectability. To read the record alone is to believe that nothing ever broke beneath its surface. But artifacts and memory refuse to be silenced so easily. Evelyn's later life was marked by a peculiar melancholy that contemporaries struggled to explain. Letters from the 1850s describe her as distant and frequently unwell. She took to spending long afternoons alone in the garden, walking the laurel paths with no lantern even in twilight, pausing always beneath the oak at the far end, as if waiting for someone who would never return. Her daughter would later write that her mother spoke often of music she could not hear, a phrase historians believe refers to Isaac's singing. And in her personal Bible, discovered in the 1920s in a trunk sealed since her death, a single pressed violet lies between the pages of the Song of Solomon, beside the verse, "Love is strong as death." The traces of Isaac after 1841 are even fainter, but they, too, persist. Freedmen's Bureau records from 1867 list an Isaac M. among those petitioning for land in Chatham County. His occupation is given as horse trainer. Whether this was the same Isaac from Rosehaven is uncertain, but if it was, he had survived. Not only the brutality of bondage, but the obliteration that followed. Oral histories tell of a man known simply as the Singer, who taught hymns to freed children on the outskirts of Savannah in the 1870s. He carried a scar on his knuckle and spoke little of the past. Perhaps he was trying to bury it, or perhaps he knew that the past, once spoken aloud, could be used against him again. By the time Evelyn died in 1889, Rosehaven itself was already decaying. The fields had gone fallow, the columns cracked, the jasmine overgrown. Her husband had squandered much of the family fortune on poor investments, and the house was sold off in parcels in the early 20th century. Yet the garden remained, and with it, the oak and the night-blooming jasmine that had witnessed what the ledgers tried to erase. Even now, visitors to the site, now a small historical park, speak of a strange quiet in that shaded alcove, as if the air itself remembers. The roses bloom thickest near the patch of earth where the unmarked grave was found. The oak bends lower each year, its branches arched like arms around a memory too heavy to lift. The ledger lied, but it did not lie well enough. Its silence, once considered a mark of order, now reads as an indictment. What it omits, the love it refused to name, the child it would not acknowledge, the humanity it sought to reduce to property, speaks louder than anything it records. And in that silence, we are forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that history is not simply a collection of facts, but a battleground of memory. What is remembered and what is erased are acts of power. And the most dangerous lies are often written not in falsehoods, but in omissions. It is tempting to look at Evelyn and Isaac's story and call it tragic, and it is. But tragedy implies finality, a conclusion written and sealed. This story resists that. It lingers in the gaps of the archive, in the missing pages of the ledger, in the whispered testimonies passed down across generations. It survives in the tarnish of a daguerreotype and the scent of jasmine on a warm Georgia night. It asks us to consider how many other ledgers, how many other neat lines of ink, conceal histories just as human and just as deliberately erased. And so we end where we began, with a ledger, a lie, and the unbearable weight of what was hidden beneath it. Yet we leave knowing more than we did when we started. We know that beneath the veneer of Southern gentility, love could bloom even where the law forbade it. We know that even the most powerful families could not fully erase the truths they feared. And we know that history, no matter how carefully curated, will always betray its secrets to those patient enough to look between the lines. If you've stayed with this story until now, I'd like to ask you to leave a trace of your own. Let us know in the comments what city you're watching from and what time you hit play. Because every place, every hour, shapes the way we hear the past. And perhaps, in naming where we are, we help keep stories like Evelyn and Isaac's alive a little longer. Their story does not end with the ledger's silence. It lives in the artifacts that refuse to disappear, in the memories that refuse to die, and in the questions that remain forever unanswered. Did they dream of a life beyond Rosehaven? Did they imagine a world where their love would not need to hide in the shadows of a garden? We cannot know. All we can do is listen to the whispers in the laurel walk, to the song that drifts across time, and to the defiant heartbeat beneath the ledger's lie.